Chelsea Burns had never believed in fate. After spending 10 years in the field as a consulting geologist, she knew the Earth didn't care about human stories. It moved on its own time, for its own reasons. But when she stepped onto the sloping 2-acre parcel nestled at the edge of the Oak Ridge community, surrounded by dense pines and bisected by a shallow natural basin, something in her chest loosened. Not joy, not relief, just stillness, the kind she hadn't felt in years. It was late afternoon, and the air was heavy with pine and distant salt, the kind of quiet that felt earned, not given. The property was old and unmanicured, wild in ways that suited her. Patches of stone half swallowed by moss, a dry concrete reservoir structure tucked into the earth like a forgotten relic. It had no practical use anymore, but to her it was a landmark, a geological scar telling stories in silence. She hadn't come here to join a community or decorate a porch. She'd come to stop moving. Her last contract, a months-long stint on an unstable slope near Juneau, had drained her of whatever fragments of social tolerance she'd managed to preserve. Chelsea had spent the last decade being temporary. Temporary teams, temporary housing, temporary peace. The house on Willow Basin Drive was her first long-term plan since grad school, and it felt precariously ambitious. The escrow had closed quietly, no complications, no red flags. Her realtor, a man with a sun-damaged Lexus and an air of practiced detachment, had only warned her that the HOA here can be particular, before shrugging and sliding the final documents across the table. She hadn't thought much of it. The property wasn't within their official boundary lines. She had double-checked the legal description twice. The first weeks were uneventful in the best possible way. Chelsea spent her mornings clearing brush, marking the perimeter of the lot, and sketching rough designs for the small workspace she planned to build near the back edge of the property. The reservoir structure, which had been constructed decades earlier as part of a failed runoff management plan, intrigued her with its erosion lines and sediment layering. She had dreams of building a research shed near it. Nothing elaborate, just a space of her own, quiet and dry, where she could finally begin archiving years of field notes. Nights were slow, deliciously so. No hallway lights under motel doors. No wind-shaken tents, just crickets, the occasional owl, and the deep, humming dark. So when Chelsea awoke one morning to the sound of children's voices just beyond her bedroom window, her mind didn't register alarm at first. It was too surreal. She padded barefoot to the back deck and froze. A woman in yoga pants was laying down a mat near the reservoir. A toddler teetered dangerously close to the ledge, and 2 boys were kicking a ball across what yesterday had been untouched grass. A Subaru with the hatch open sat at the base of her gravel drive, its back stuffed with picnic supplies and 2 camping chairs. The woman saw her, smiled as if they'd met before, and said, "Hey, hope it's okay. We usually come early before it gets too hot. We'll be out of your hair in an hour or so." Chelsea stared at her. "You're on private property," she said, but her voice sounded foreign even to herself. The woman's smile didn't falter. "Oh, I thought the park was still open access. It's been public for years, hasn't it?" Chelsea didn't respond. She couldn't, because suddenly the stillness that had made this place sacred to her didn't feel earned anymore. It felt stolen. Chelsea had always thought of herself as someone who could adapt to disruption. Years of living in temporary housing, dealing with bureaucracies in foreign countries, waiting out storms in tents while equipment rattled outside, had given her a tolerance for inconvenience. But the sight of strangers comfortably spreading blankets and treating her property as though it were a municipal green space was different. It was not an inconvenience. It was an intrusion. After ushering the yoga mat woman and her children out with a clipped insistence that this was private land and not open to anyone, she sat on the steps of her deck for nearly an hour, staring at the still fluttering leaves where the ball had rolled. Through the grass. Her pulse remained uneven long after they left. Not because she felt threatened in the physical sense, but because of how easily they had dismissed her authority as the owner. The casualness of their presence frightened her more than hostility might have. Later that evening, as the light thinned and the first crickets began their evening chorus, Chelsea opened her laptop, determined to figure out what had happened. She typed her address into Google Maps. At first, her eyes glazed over the aerial view, the rectangular boundary of her property, the basin glimmering pale gray in satellite resolution, the trees crowding in at the edges. But then she saw it, bold and indisputable. Willow Basin Community Eco Park. Below the label was a cluster of reviews, all glowing, all recent. 5 stars from someone named Mandy R. with the words, "Hidden treasure, my kids love to run around the concrete bowl." A comment from Nathaniel Cyclist praising the terrain as a perfect spot to stretch after long rides. Even a review titled, "Best place for acoustic jams," where a man named Devin described bringing his guitar because the natural echo makes it sound like a cathedral. Chelsea read and reread the page, scrolling down through nearly 24 reviews, each accompanied by photos of her land, her trees, her gravel drive, the very reservoir she had been cataloging. Some of the photos had been taken from odd angles, likely before she moved in, but others were recent enough that she recognized the folding chair she had left by the back fence. Her chest tightened with a sharp, rising unease. These weren't just mistaken visitors. Her property had been deliberately misrepresented to the world. She filed a request with Google immediately, flagging the listing as incorrect and explaining in detail that it was private residential property, not a public park. The automated reply came within minutes. "Thank you for your feedback. Your request will be reviewed." No timeline, no guarantee of action. It was the digital equivalent of being placed on hold. She closed her laptop with more force than necessary and leaned back, trying to steady her breathing. Rationally, she told herself, it would be corrected within days. The system was flawed, yes, but not malicious, and yet the unease did not recede. Because the listing was not just a mistake, it was detailed, curated, and persistent. Someone had been maintaining it. The following days proved her fears justified. Each morning, she found new evidence of intrusion. A couple parked a hatchback by the entrance one Saturday and unloaded coolers and kites. A group of teenagers arrived the next afternoon, laughing too loudly as they scrambled down the slope of the basin, their sneakers leaving bright rubber streaks across the concrete. When Chelsea confronted them, they shrugged and pointed to their phones. "It says it's a park," one of them muttered, barely looking at her before clambering back to their car. The phrase burrowed into her. "It says it's a park," as if the digital text had more authority than the deed locked in her filing cabinet, as if the truth was less real than a line of code. The situation escalated in a way she hadn't anticipated. Late one evening, headlights swept across her windows, and Chelsea stepped outside to find a family unloading folding chairs and lanterns as if preparing for a late-night gathering. She stopped them firmly, voice sharp this time, and the father glared at her with the offended look of someone denied something they believed they had a right to. "This is community land," he insisted. "I've lived here 15 years. People have always used this space. Just because you bought it doesn't mean you get to erase history." His words struck her with a cold weight. Not only were these visitors uninvited, they believed she was the trespasser. The inversion of reality chilled her more than their stubbornness. By the end of the second week, Chelsea had grown exhausted. Each time she walked to her mailbox, she felt exposed, her body tense at the sound of tires on gravel. The quiet sanctuary she had purchased to escape transient chaos had become a revolving door of strangers treating her boundaries as negotiable. Determined to prove to herself that she was not losing her grip, she drove to the county recorder's office. The clerk, a man in his 60s with patient eyes, pulled up the property records without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am, this parcel is private residential, owned outright by Chelsea Burns, No easements filed, no community designations. He printed the documents for her, stamping them with the official seal. Chelsea held the papers like a talisman as she walked back to her car, feeling both relieved and unsettled. She had proof, but proof had not stopped the tide of belief. When she returned home that evening, she found something new, a wooden post at the edge of her property with a laminated sign bolted to it. In crisp block letters it read, "Willow Basin Community Park, open dawn to dusk." The logo at the bottom was not the county's. It was the emblem of the local HOA. Chelsea's stomach dropped. She hadn't even been aware her property fell within their orbit. But now, with the sign gleaming under her porch light, she realized this was no longer about digital mistakes or confused families. This was organized. Someone had decided, deliberately and with paperwork or symbols she had never agreed to, that her sanctuary was not hers at all. And as she stared at the sign, with its authoritative lettering and counterfeit permanence, Chelsea understood for the first time that this was not going to resolve quietly. Chelsea had always believed that conflict was something you could de-escalate with patience, logic, and the right documents in hand, but the first real confrontation with the HOA destroyed that illusion in a matter of minutes. After discovering the wooden post and the laminated sign on her boundary line, she removed it that same night, dragging it to her shed like it was some malignant object that might regrow if left outside. The next morning, she woke to find not only that the sign had been replaced, but that there were two of them now, planted on either side of her drive, as if framing a ceremonial entrance. The audacity of it left her stunned. She called the HOA office number listed on the flyer pinned beneath the new signs and was greeted by a receptionist who seemed to have been trained in the art of polite indifference. When Chelsea explained the situation, that her property was being misrepresented as a park, that unauthorized signs had been posted without her consent, that strangers were trespassing daily, the receptionist listened silently and then said, "I'll note your concerns and pass them along to the board," Chelsea asked when she might hear back. "These things are usually addressed at the monthly meeting," the woman said evenly, as though Chelsea's complaints were no different than a broken streetlight. Chelsea drove to the HOA office the following afternoon, determined to speak to someone in person. The office itself was tucked into a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a dentist's clinic, the kind of place that suggested bureaucracy without authority, yet carried the strange weight of power. The man who introduced himself as the president, Alan Rivers, was not the stern bureaucrat she had pictured, but a man in his early 50s with the friendly, guarded demeanor of a salesman. He listened to her summary with an expression of patient neutrality, nodding occasionally, his hands folded neatly on the table. When she finished, he said, "I understand this has been frustrating for you, Miss Burns, but the basin area has historically been accessible to the community. Our records indicate it was once considered shared open space by the developer, though it was never formally transferred. We've simply been preserving what residents have long enjoyed." Chelsea's mouth went dry as she tried to process his words. "Your records might indicate whatever you want them to," she said tightly, pulling out the stamped property documents from the county. "This is mine. It has never been public land. You're trespassing on private property by posting those signs." Alan glanced at the papers, his expression unchanged, and then leaned back slightly in his chair. "I appreciate your diligence, but perception matters too. If the community believes a place is shared, and if it has been used as such for years, then in practical terms it becomes part of the community fabric. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to ensure continuity. It would be disruptive, frankly, to deny access now." Chelsea stared at him, incredulous. "Disruptive for whom? For people who like free land that isn't theirs? For your office, which wants to boost property values by pretending there's a park here? You're manufacturing reality." His face hardened slightly at that, though his voice remained calm. Ms. Burns, you're welcome to bring this up at our meeting next week. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you avoid removing the signage again. Tampering with community property could result in fines. The words struck her with their quiet menace. Fines. Community property. He had just told her that her land, legally hers, was theirs in the ways that mattered to him, and that resisting this theft would make her the criminal. She left the office shaking, gripping her keys so tightly that the edges cut into her palm. When she reached her car, she sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the dashboard, trying to steady her breath. It felt surreal, like the ground rules of the world had shifted overnight, and she was the only one still playing by the old ones. The intrusions intensified. That weekend, she came home from a grocery run to find 3 cars parked along her drive, their trunks open, lawn chairs unfolded, children darting through the trees as if rehearsing for a festival. When she ordered them to leave, one man stepped forward, tall and red-faced, and told her bluntly that she had no right to push them out. The HOA told us this is community access. We pay dues for this. Who are you to say otherwise? The confrontation drew the eyes of nearby neighbors, some of whom watched from porches with uneasy expressions that could have been sympathy but felt more like silent judgment. Chelsea forced the group off her property, but the words echoed long after they were gone. We pay dues for this. The lie had become fact because it had been repeated enough times. That night, unable to sleep, Chelsea scrolled through the online listing again. More reviews had appeared in just the past 2 days, praising the park for its tranquility and family-friendly space. Some even mentioned her directly, though not by name, calling her the new owner who's trying to ruin it for everyone. It wasn't just trespass anymore, it was narrative warfare, a rewriting of reality in real time. She slammed her laptop shut, her heart pounding with a rage she didn't know how to channel. 2 days later, she found something that made her stomach twist with dread. Along the outer edge of the basin, someone had installed a small wooden bench, anchored deep into the soil, as though it had been there for years. A paper plaque laminated in plastic had been affixed to it, in memory of Margaret Collins, who loved this place. Chelsea had never heard the name, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone was constructing a history for her land, complete with artifacts and dedications, designed to convince everyone, including eventually herself, that it had always been communal. She stood there in the evening light, staring at the bench, the plaque glinting faintly, and for the first time she felt something worse than anger. She felt the creeping, destabilizing sense that she was being erased from her own property. Chelsea had thought the wooden bench was a strange escalation, but in the days that followed, the situation veered into territory she had not imagined even in her most pessimistic calculations. What unnerved her was not simply the brazenness of strangers arriving on her land, but the quiet, methodical way the story was being cemented around her, as if she had moved into a place where reality itself had already been claimed and assigned, before she ever set foot on the soil. She spent hours one evening combing through property archives, determined to locate some reference to this supposed community space the HOA kept insisting had existed. There were references to the original development plan in the 1990s, but the only documents of note were proposals for storm drainage, abandoned before they were ever implemented. The reservoir had been built in 1957, a relic of a county engineering experiment that failed to produce results, and had been sold to a private owner in the early 70s. From there, it had passed through 3 different hands before it was listed on the market, where Chelsea had purchased it in what she thought was a straightforward sale. Nothing in the record suggested anything but private ownership. And yet she now found herself fighting ghosts of invented tradition, a public memory carefully manufactured and zealously repeated. The turning point came when she dug deeper into the digital trail left by the so-called park enthusiasts. She had noticed the name Doc Martin appearing across multiple platforms, not only on the original Google Maps listing but also in archived blog posts on neighborhood forums, comments on local community boards, and even in a short entry on a travel website that highlighted little-known green spaces worth visiting. The language was oddly consistent, written in a tone of gentle authority, describing the basin as a restorative site for reflection and community togetherness. The words carried the cadence of a naturalist or an amateur historian, someone who had the time and patience to build credibility. Yet the more Chelsea searched, the more she realized that Doc Martin was not a person anyone had actually met. The profile picture on the forum was a stock image of a tree line. The email addresses were dead ends. The writing stretched back for years, but never included specifics about the supposed author's life. It was a mask, and behind it, someone had been slowly weaving a narrative strong enough to become accepted truth. The discovery shook her, but it also gave her a thread to follow. She contacted an old colleague from her field days, a data-savvy friend named Javier who had once specialized in digital mapping projects. Over a late-night call, she explained the situation, sending him screenshots of the Google listing and the reviews. Javier listened quietly, then said, "This doesn't look organic. The accounts posting reviews were created within tight clusters of time, and several are linked by IP metadata to the same region." If I had to guess, someone deliberately seeded this years ago, probably as part of a campaign to inflate neighborhood appeal. If the HOA was working with developers, they might have wanted a faux park to boost interest. People don't check county records, they check Google, and once enough reviews stack up, the lie stabilizes. His calm, precise tone steadied her even as his words sank in like ice. The park wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was an operation. Armed with this, Chelsea returned to the HOA, this time bringing a printed dossier of evidence. She attended their monthly meeting in the community center gymnasium, where rows of folding chairs faced a table of board members who looked down at her like teachers receiving an unruly student. When her turn came to speak, she laid out the county documents, the chain of ownership, and finally the details Javier had uncovered about the fabricated online presence. Her voice shook with restrained anger, but she was clear, methodical, impossible to ignore. For a moment, she thought she saw flickers of doubt in some of the faces watching from the audience. But then Alan Rivers, with his salesman's composure, leaned forward and said, "With all due respect, Ms. Burns, what you have presented are legal technicalities. The board's responsibility is to the lived reality of the neighborhood, not to dry pages in a courthouse. For decades, families have enjoyed the basin as shared space. If online sources reflect that, then it only confirms what we already know, that this area belongs to the community spirit, even if some paperwork suggests otherwise." His words were met with a ripple of murmurs and nods, and Chelsea felt her stomach drop as she realized the trap. It was not about law. It was about consensus, about shaping enough belief that law could be bent to match it. When she walked out of the meeting, several neighbors avoided her eyes, but one older woman touched her arm briefly and whispered, "They did something similar before. Fenced off a trail behind my house and claimed it was theirs. I couldn't fight it. Be careful." The woman disappeared into the crowd before Chelsea could ask more, leaving her with a cold rush of confirmation that this was not an isolated struggle but part of a larger pattern. She drove home in silence, headlights cutting the dark road, her grip on the wheel white-knuckled. She felt the weight of being outnumbered, outvoiced, caught in a storm of narratives designed to paint her as the villain. That night, she dreamed of the basin filling with water, rising slowly until it lapped against the rim and spilled into her house, drowning her belongings in silence while unseen crowds applauded from the trees. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, the image burned into her chest. As she stood on her deck with a mug of coffee cooling in her hand, she looked at the basin with new eyes. It was no longer the relic that had drawn her in, no longer the geological curiosity she had planned to study and preserve. It was a stage, and she had been forced into the role of antagonist by people who didn't even know her name. For the first time, Chelsea felt that she might not be able to simply defend herself. She might have to attack. The week after the HOA meeting marked the beginning of what Chelsea would later think of as the siege. Not because anyone attacked her directly, but because every detail of her daily life seemed to acquire the weight of surveillance, intrusion, and quiet pressure. It began with the installation of new signage, larger and more official-looking than the flimsy laminated posts she had removed before. This time, metal frames appeared overnight, bolted into the ground with cement, painted in the same green and white scheme used by city park departments, complete with a stylized tree icon that mimicked municipal branding. The words read, Willow Basin Community Park, maintained by Oak Ridge HOA. Chelsea stood staring at the sign the next morning with a strange hollowness in her chest, as though she were staring at an alternate version of reality that had simply been erected around her in the night, unchallenged and unchallengeable. When she called the HOA office again, she was put on hold for nearly an hour, transferred twice, and finally told by a brisk male voice that any alterations to community infrastructure without board approval could subject her to legal penalties. She tried to insist that her property was not community infrastructure, that she had county documents proving sole ownership, but the man simply repeated the phrase as if it were scripted. Any alterations to community infrastructure will be subject to penalties. By the time she hung up, her hand was shaking so badly that she dropped the receiver back into the cradle twice before it settled. The visitors became bolder. Families now arrived in steady streams on weekends, some parking brazenly in her driveway as if she were the intruder. She confronted one group who were lighting a small camping stove near the basin, demanding that they leave before they started a fire in the dry undergrowth. The man leading them, wearing a baseball cap and mirrored sunglasses, told her flatly that she should take it up with the HOA, and that if she kept harassing residents, she could be cited for intimidation. He said it in the tone of someone repeating information already planted in his mind by a reliable authority. Chelsea realized with a sick churn in her stomach that the board had been spreading stories about her, framing her not as a homeowner defending her space, but as a hostile obstacle blocking rightful access. The breaking point came when she returned from the grocery store one Tuesday evening to find that someone had placed trash bins at the edge of her lot, labeled with HOA stickers reading Park Waste Only. Inside them were crumpled flyers advertising a Community Cleanup Day at Willow Basin, with her address printed in bold letters as the meeting location. The event date was set for the upcoming Saturday. Chelsea gripped one of the papers so tightly that the edges cut her fingers, unable to process the audacity. They weren't just encouraging people to come, they were scheduling an event on her land without even telling her. She spent the next 2 days trying frantically to contact city officials, bouncing between zoning offices and community liaisons, but everywhere she turned she encountered shrugs, delays, or bureaucratic walls. One official even told her that the city did not intervene in disputes between homeowners and HOAs unless there was evidence of criminal activity. When Chelsea protested that this was criminal, that signs had been erected on her land without consent, that false information was being circulated, the official sighed and said, "That's something you'll need to resolve privately, ma'am. Perhaps with mediation." Saturday arrived with the weight of inevitability. From her kitchen window, Chelsea saw cars lining the road, people unloading gloves, rakes, and coolers, treating her home like the staging ground for a festival. They moved with the confidence of entitlement, not even glancing toward the house as if the owner didn't exist. She stepped outside, shaking with a fury that felt almost physical, and shouted that they had no right to be there. A few people looked uncomfortable. Some muttered apologies as they shuffled back to their cars, but others stood firm. One man, wearing an HOA volunteer vest, told her that she shouldn't be so hostile, considering she was living next to a shared resource. When she screamed that it wasn't shared, that it was hers, He only shook his head with the calm pity of someone speaking to a child. That night, when the last car had left and the basin was littered with soda cans and trampled grass, Chelsea sat on her porch in the darkness, staring at the mess. She thought about the way the man had looked at her, as though she were the one twisting reality, as though her ownership documents were the lie and the manufactured history was the truth. The sense of isolation pressed down on her like a physical weight, more crushing than the noise of the crowds. She realized then that the battle had shifted from law to perception, and in that arena she was outnumbered 100-1. But even in her exhaustion, something inside her hardened. If they wanted to turn her sanctuary into a stage for their theater of falsehoods, then she would not simply retreat into the wings. She would fight, not just with words, not just with documents, but with whatever pressure she could summon to force their narrative to collapse under its own weight. She didn't yet know what that would mean, or how far she would have to go, but the thought no longer frightened her. It steadied her. By the time autumn settled over Oak Ridge and the basin filled with leaves that whirled like brown confetti in the wind, Chelsea had reached a state of endurance that felt like sleepwalking. She moved through each day with the taut focus of someone bracing for the next intrusion, each knock on the door or rumble of tires down the gravel drive igniting a pulse of dread in her chest. Yet she had also learned to prepare, to anticipate, to build her own arsenal of evidence and countermeasures. The turning point came when she discovered that the HOA had filed a complaint against her in municipal court, accusing her of obstructing historical community access and demanding that she cease hostile actions against residents. It was surreal to read those words on official stationery, as though the entire fiction had metastasized into law. But she did not crumble. She contacted Javier again, who connected her with an attorney specializing in property disputes, a woman named Monica Graves, whose calm, unyielding voice over the phone steadied Chelsea more than any document ever could. Monica agreed to represent her and immediately set about dismantling the HOA's claims. The day of the hearing arrived gray and damp, the courthouse steps slick with drizzle as Chelsea walked in clutching the folder of documents Monica had prepared. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust and polish, the air heavy with the hush of routine bureaucracy. The HOA board members sat together at one table, Alan Rivers at the center, his expression as smooth as glass, radiating the confidence of someone who believed he was defending not just property, but principle. Chelsea sat beside Monica, whose presence radiated calm authority. When the judge called the case, Alan launched into a polished statement about the basin's long-standing role as communal green space, citing supposed testimonies from residents who had used it for decades without interruption. He spoke of children's laughter, of neighborhood tradition, of collective well-being. His words were lyrical, designed to appeal not to law but to sentiment, and for a moment Chelsea feared the narrative might succeed here too. But then Monica rose, her voice firm, measured, unflinching. She laid out the chain of ownership, each document stamped and sealed, tracing the property's history back half a century. She presented aerial photographs from county archives showing the basin fenced, unused, unmarked, directly contradicting the tale of communal enjoyment. Then she produced Javier's analysis of the digital footprint, demonstrating how reviews had been seeded in clusters, how the identity of Doc Martin was fabricated, how the entire digital presence had been orchestrated by accounts linked to Oak Ridge, HOA's office network. The silence in the room thickened as the weight of her evidence built, each detail stripping away the veneer of Alan's narrative until only the raw mechanics of manipulation remained. Chelsea watched his composure falter, just slightly, the first crack in the mask she had ever seen. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped, and asked a single question. "Mr. Rivers, can you provide any legal record designating this property as public or community-owned?" Alan hesitated, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smooth facade, before replying, Not in a legal sense, Your Honor, but in a practical sense. The judge cut him off, voice sharp now. This court is concerned with legal sense. The documents presented by Ms. Burns and her counsel are clear. The property is privately owned and has never been designated otherwise. The actions taken by the HOA to misrepresent this land, both digitally and physically, constitute overreach and, in certain respects, fraud. The words seemed to echo in Chelsea's ears, reverberating like a long-delayed chord of music. Relief surged through her in a strange, almost painful wave, as though her body had forgotten how to feel it. The judge ordered the immediate removal of all HOA signage and prohibited the association from making any further claims about her land. He added that the matter would be referred to county prosecutors for review of potential criminal misconduct regarding the falsification of documents and the coordinated misinformation campaign. Alan's face remained frozen, but the stillness in his posture spoke of fury barely concealed. When Chelsea stepped out of the courthouse into the cool air, Monica walking beside her with a small nod of satisfaction, she felt as though she were breathing for the first time in months. The world did not look different. The drizzle still streaked the pavement, cars still hummed along the street, but the weight that had pressed on her chest for so long had shifted, loosened. She knew the battle was not entirely over, that resentment would simmer among neighbors who had believed the lie, but the core truth had been restored and validated in the only place that mattered, a court of law. For the first time since moving to Willow Basin Drive, the land felt like hers again, not because she held the deed, but because she had defended it and won. The weeks after the court ruling unfolded with a kind of uneasy quiet. Not peace exactly, but the silence that follows when a storm has exhausted itself and left the ground raw and saturated. The metal signs were taken down under order, their cement bases pried from the soil by a hired crew who worked quickly, avoiding her eyes, as if ashamed to be dismantling what they had once so confidently installed. The trash bins disappeared, the flyers stopped appearing in mailboxes, and the online listing for Willow Basin Park was finally removed, leaving behind only a digital void where hundreds of glowing reviews had once fabricated history. Chelsea walked her property in the mornings with a strange sense of reclamation, noticing the scars left behind by the months of intrusion, the trampled grass, the patches of scorched earth where camp stoves had burned too close to the trees, the faint impressions of benches and bins long since dragged away. Each mark was a reminder of how easily reality could be rewritten when enough voices insisted upon it, and how fragile the truth became when left undefended. Some neighbors no longer greeted her, crossing the street rather than meeting her eyes, and she accepted the distance as inevitable. Others quietly began to show a cautious solidarity, dropping by with small acknowledgments that they too had felt pressure from the HOA in different ways, fines that never made sense, rules that seemed to appear overnight, small infringements, dressed up as community spirit. Chelsea listened without offering promises because she had no desire to become anyone's champion. But she knew that her fight had opened a fracture in the facade of inevitability the board had projected for years. That alone was enough. On a cold November evening, she stood by the edge of the basin, the last light thinning into the trees, and breathed in the damp air. For months she had felt herself erased, her ownership mocked, her solitude stolen, but the land had endured beneath the noise. The basin was not a park, not a communal stage, not a myth for someone else's profit. It was hers, and more importantly, it was real, unyielding to stories that tried to overwrite it. She touched the rough concrete rim, worn with decades of weather, and felt something settle inside her. The fight had not restored her faith in systems or neighbors, but it had given her something harder and more durable. The certainty that silence was not the same as surrender, and that truth, though fragile, could still be defended if one refused to let go.